I want to talk about a deeply human question, a question that you've asked a lot over the course of your life. It might have taken different forms, but the question basically gets at what makes you stand out from the person sitting next to you? If you're watching this in a coffee shop, what makes you stand out from the barista? What makes you stand out, for that matter, from any of your siblings or from your friends? What makes you stand out from the rest of the natural world? It could be your pet cat. It could be your pet rock. How do you know who you are? And where would you look? How would you know? Who do you give permission to help you find out who you are? The question I want us to ask again, I invite you to ask once again, is who am I? My name is Joseph King Barkley, and I get to be an executive coach, and I'm the president of the Meta Performance Institute, which is a program that helps people become coaches. But before that, I planted 2 churches in the Hollywood area of California. That's a place who's asking, who am I, all the time? And often the answer to who am I is, well, who do you need me to be? Who do I need to be to get that part? Who do I need to be to get that job? Who do I need to be to have this relationship? If you were to answer that question, maybe you would start in very significant places. Maybe you would start talking about your ethnicity, or maybe you would talk about your job or your dream job, or maybe you would think about your identity in terms of your gender or your sexuality. Maybe you would think about your personality, your Enneagram, or the stances that you take politically, or what you advocate for. Now, listen, I cannot tell you who you are, and I don't think you would believe me if I tried. But who among us hasn't wanted some ideas? And that's what I hope to provide us in the next few minutes together. I remember taking the Myers-Briggs and the StrengthsFinder twice, something that they tell you not to do. But about 15 years ago when I took it the first time, the perception of the people around me was so influential in my life that I took those tests as the person who I believed other people believed I was, or who I thought other people needed me to be or wanted me to be. And so when I got the results, it seemed to fit their expectations. But here's the kicker. I based major life decisions on the results of that test. I abdicated responsibilities that I now know I could have shouldered. I hesitated to seize opportunities that I now, in hindsight, know that could have been great for me in my future, were perfect fits for who I really actually am. I oversold some of my weaknesses. I undersold some of my strengths. Basically, I cast myself in the wrong story. I am so aware of how cliched this finding yourself conversation and living up to your potential can really sound if we're not careful. But you know what, though? You know where that comes from? That longing? I think, and you don't have to believe me, I think you and I were born for greatness. We really were. And I know that sounds like another meme, but come on, which one of us, when we were little kids, didn't dream of growing up to be something great? Who among us when we were kids dreamt of growing up to mediocrity? Man, when I grow up, I'm going to pay some bills and have a stable marriage and predictable kids and some acquaintances. Like, no way. When I was younger, I wanted to slay a dragon and sweep a princess off her feet and have adventures. And it makes you wonder if maybe we were onto something before life and degrees and taxes happened. See, I believe, and we believe here, that life has dignity baked into it. In fact, it's what most of us stand up for, right? When people are silenced or they're limited, we believe that people deserve more because there's something uniquely dignified about being a human. So who do we think we are? Who am I? Well, I think deep down, we're convinced that that question gets to the bottom of what it means to be human. Greatness is part of what it means to be human. So what is it that gives us any greatness as a species? And I'm willing to wager, if you're watching this and you have settled, at least to this point in your life, for mediocre love and a mediocre marriage and a mediocre job and a mediocre life, my hunch is that you have maybe for a moment stopped looking for greatness, but you haven't stopped longing for it. And you know why? I think God wants you to know your own dignity, to know what sets you apart and why you keep longing for a superlative life. I believe it's something you're built for. But have you ever noticed, for all the talk about human dignity, how undignified we can behave sometimes, like how childish and how barbaric and how selfish? The ancient philosophers observed this too. Paul, who wrote a lot of letters to the first churches a couple thousand years ago, some of the first Christians, wrote about this very dilemma in a letter to a church in Ephesus, Ephesians chapter 4. And in Ephesians chapter 4, he wanted to remind them a little bit about who they really were, even if it's different than a little bit of how they were behaving. Starting in verse 17, Paul writes, "So I tell you this, and I insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking." Now, real quick, Gentiles to this audience that Paul was writing to didn't just mean non-Jewish people. It's the way that Paul was describing the dominant culture at the time. It would kind of be like him writing to us and saying, don't just be an American, or you don't have to merely be postmodern or just Western or millennial. That's not all of who you are, even if that's the pool that you're swimming in. And he goes on to write, they, the dominant culture, they're darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of their ignorance. It's a heavy word. This ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they've given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. In other words, a lot of people around us are acting like animals. And I know in our Pixar movies we love to anthropomorphize animals, but zoologists will tell you that animals are only ever motivated by a few very simple things: survival, stimulus, and dominance. In the time that Paul was writing this letter, pleasure was utilitarian. This ancient Greek culture, they thought that pleasure was just something to be used, nothing more. It didn't have an impact, as far as they understood it, on the conscious self. So as long as everybody was okay, everybody involved with what was pleasurable was okay with it, you could do whatever you want. And for some of us, that might sound kind of familiar. They were unaware at the time, or maybe just not interested in how it affected life under the surface. Pascal actually thought that we end up opposed to ourselves if we live like this, if we give ourselves over completely to simply our passions, because our passions are not going to be enough for us. They're never complete. They never fully satisfy us. We all know what that experience is like. If we give ourselves over to this, if we think that's all of who we are or what it means to be human, we're never going to stop looking for more and more significance at the end of some rainbow that we'll never find. And it will never stop delivering less and less and less to us. And that might be part of why Paul wrote this, because desire wasn't the only thing that made us human. And if we make our desire this sort of bulletproof, unimpeachable description of who we are placing so much significance on something that ultimately is just going to degrade us or betray us or evolve radically over time, depending on the season of our lives. Counselors of college students have recently reported that the top 2 struggles that students are facing today, particularly in the wake of the global pandemic, are suicide and porn addiction. And it's hard not to see a connection between the two, because there's one that requires degrading our own life and the other one requires degrading another. It may be ordinary to be driven merely by our desires, but I would suggest that it is not human. No. I think it's human to actually have the power to choose. Verse 20, Paul continues with this exploration of who we really are. That, however, the way that the dominant culture behaves, is not the way of life you learned when you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught, with regard to your former way of life, your ordinary life, to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires that lie to us, that trick us, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, to start with changing how you think about your life in the world, and to put on the new self, created, check this out, to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. And those 2 words just simply mean like a perfect fit. That's righteousness. And holiness is different on purpose. Paul is saying, and you can decide for yourself if you agree with him, that humans have a unique capacity to be led by occurrence and concept and meaning over desire. We can decide how we define our world. We can decide what we believe about our passions and our feelings. And Paul says that there is a truth that might supersede our desires and serve us. He says there's this truth that is in Jesus. And you'll notice he didn't say There are some true things that Jesus said, but he said, no, there's something true about the very nature of Jesus that we opt into or we put on when we decide we're going to follow Jesus. We put it on like a coat, or maybe more helpfully, we put it on sort of like a lens through which we can see and understand the world. And Paul insists this Jesus idea is planted in people who follow him, and that we have a choice to adopt something unique about how we feel and about how we move through the world. And if we can follow Jesus into seeing and behaving in the world in this particular way, then that's going to reflect the nature of God in us. You know, from the first pages of these sacred texts, there was something about God, his nature, that I have seen only humans have the power to reflect. Nothing else in the natural world. I didn't always believe in Jesus, but even before I came to surrender my life to him as a junior in high school, I really did struggle to believe that there wasn't a God or some concept of God, simply because I believed there were humans. It never really lined up to me that simple evolutionary processes caved in on themselves when it came to humans. That our species, all of a sudden at this moment in evolutionary history, categorically betray the very laws that got us here, that we are not merely carbon and chaos and instinct, that all of a sudden, because we've developed this prefrontal cortex, we have a choice to love something that is weaker than us, to serve something that we could dominate. We have a choice to deny our desires if it means something healthier can happen. So when I considered that we were designed possibly for character and mindfulness, and we have a choice to be heroic and to disobey our urges for something greater, there was a cognitive tension for me. And so when I started to follow Jesus and believe what he said about what it meant to be human, it started to just make sense logically. Because I don't think those are just natural strengths of being a human. I think they're transcendent strengths. And that's not to say that we do this consistently because we're Jesus followers or we do it completely. In fact, it would seem that there's only really a fractured version of this, even when we're operating at our best. But Jesus appeals to that longing that we have to be truly ourselves. When he says he's quoted in John's biography, in John chapter 14, "You will realize that I'm in the Father and you are in me and I am in you." In other words, we know that we have these capacities that set us apart from all the rest of creation by miles, not just mutations. We have self-awareness, and we have appreciation of beauty, and we have concern about a future. My dog Gruber can't even fathom what the next 5 minutes are going to look like. We can think about our past, and we can think about our choices, and we are creative, we have humor. But I actually believe underneath all of that, the real source of human dignity, the real evidence of our real identity comes from something else. I believe that not only can humans choose, but only humans can choose to love. This is a little bit of what that might look like as Paul goes on in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 25. "Therefore, if this is what it really means to be human, each of you must put off falsehood, speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. In your anger, don't sin. Don't let the sun go down while you're still angry. And do not give the devil a foothold, the liar, the enemy of humanity. Those who have been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with their own hands, even if their desires would tell them something different, that they may have something to share with those in need." Verse 29, "Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling, and slander, along with every other form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you." So love is more than just an expression of my desire in the world. I love chocolate ice cream, but I have a choice not to eat it. No, love is, I don't know, somebody tearing you down and you choosing to build them up. Love that really taps into the core of our humanity means that even when you feel like taking, you choose to give. Love that is a symptom of our core humanity means that even when you feel like hiding, you choose to be vulnerable. Love means that even when you feel like violence, you can reconcile. When you feel like hate, you can encourage. And that's what Jesus showed us about what it means to be human. And that's why I follow him, because I want to figure out who I really am. I think it's common to return to some of our animalistic tendencies. It makes sense. We're encouraged all the time to do whatever we want, not to repress desire, that somehow that's repressing our identity and who we really are. But have you ever noticed that every time someone encourages you to just you be you, boo, and you do what you want to do, it always comes with this little caveat that we've been wrestling with since the ancient Greek culture and long before that. Do whatever you want to do as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else, as best as you can calculate it. Have you ever wondered, though, if that little qualification on your desire doesn't just tell you something about what it means to be human, but it might tell you everything about what it means to be human? What if down deep, I am built for something more than just doing what I want? What if I'm built to care for you? What if I'm built to advocate for you? What if I'm built to put your needs ahead of my wants, and that I get a reward of joy and peace and life and energy when I choose to do that, because it's coming out of who I really think I am? There's this little curious note in that long list that I just read of what it looks like from Paul's perspective to love. He said in there, you might have caught it, he says, don't grieve the Holy Spirit. In other words, don't bring God grief. And that phrase doesn't show up a whole lot in these source documents. It's not used often to describe God's anger. In fact, when it comes up, it's used to describe his anguish, which is an interesting thing to think that the creator of the universe experiences anguish. Something close to despair, not complete, but something like devastation. And here, it's put right in the middle of a list of ways that we treat each other as less than equals, as less than human, as objects for our own pleasure or consumption. I think what Paul is saying here is that God is miserable when humans can't see each other the way that he sees us. In the 1700s, there were few people who were advocating for African slaves in the United States. You may have never heard of a man named John Woolman, and he was a white, wealthy, religious man. He was a Quaker. But he, different than many of the people I think that he ran with, recognized that something was wrong. And he dedicated his life to ending enslavement. But he did it in the most peculiar way. He did it one by one, showing kindness to men and women who were enslaved, and humility with those who were enslaving them, appealing to both parties in a way that he believed God really wanted him to. There was no threats, there was no screaming, there was no campaign trail, and not that those things wouldn't have been effective and weren't effective in the future of the civil rights movement and the abolition of slavery, but for John Woolman, he decided to take it one person at a time, to love the victim and the victimizer. And over the course of 20 years, there was not one single Quaker who owned a slave. Years before the Declaration of Independence was signed, almost 100 years before the Civil War, they were the first social group in power to renounce enslavement. Not because they were forced into it or they were shamed into it. They were loved into becoming more human. Paul ends this exploration of our dignity in the first couple verses of chapter 5. He says, follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. Follow God's example. And what's that? He says love, the way that Jesus showed us how to love. Love that loves when it doesn't feel like it. Love that gives itself for the object of its love. Not love that consumes, not love that uses, not love that fails the object of its love, but love that gives and doesn't just give so long as it's getting. A love that gives without strings attached. So even though we have rejected God, and frankly, that might be an honest assessment of where you're at today. You might say, as far as I can tell, I'm rejecting any concept of God or that there is a God who loves me based on my experience. But I invite you just for a moment to consider that if there is a God and you have rejected him, what is fascinating about this God is that he has decided to love you first, as is, even in the midst of your rejection. He didn't require us to make it up to him, all this love that he wanted to give us in the sacrifice of his son. We are absolved and we are free to become who we were meant to be. I think only humans have the capacity to choose self-giving. Only humans have the power to deny their instincts of self-preservation and advocate for each other and to build up rather than tear down. So who am I? Who are you? You are a human created as a reflection of what God is really like. And the primary evidence of that is that you and I can choose love. I think that's who you are. I recently read the story of Michelle McCambridge, and she worked at a JCPenney, which frankly is kind of hard to find. One day, right there at the counter of JCPenney, she came face to face with this woman who had stolen her identity. A week before this moment, she got a call from the FBI that someone was taking out credit cards in her name and racking up thousands of dollars of debt. And she got to see some surveillance photos. But the woman that she saw in the surveillance photo, who was pretending to be her, wasn't anybody that she recognized. And then all of a sudden, here she was standing right in front of her at this counter, asking to open a credit account in Michelle's name. So Michelle, she excused herself and she covertly got security to fix the cameras on the woman. And she started this chain of events that the FBI now has said brought down a huge ring of identity thieves who were stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the FBI said that it was her level-headedness in that moment that made it happen. But McCambridge would say she was enraged in the moment. And there was this interview where she said, "No violence was done to me, but that was my identity. It was a violation of who I am." When I read that, it kind of made me think, what if I came to the search for my identity, you came to the search for your identity with that same indignation? That, you know what, for years, or maybe just for the last week, I have been walking around as a pretend version of myself. There's somebody out there with Joseph King Barkley's name who is right now acting like an imposter. And what if I looked at all the ways that I wanted to consume and define myself by my desires and say, imposter, that's enough, I want my identity back. See, the truth is, I think ultimately we're powerless to do that on our own. So could I tell you that Jesus was even more outraged about this false humanity than you and I will ever be. And that's why he gave his life to free you from the debt and to give you a shot at becoming who you were really made to be. A soul bought with love, bound by love, and sent in love. One of the FBI agents involved in the case said that identity theft is one of the hardest crimes to solve. But the chances radically increase when the victim engages in the fight. So will you fight for your own dignity? Will you fight for your identity? Will you say yes to Jesus again today and choose to love the way that he is leading us to love? If you're watching this and you have something to write with, I can encourage you to get that out, or maybe you just want to type something on the notes of your phone. But I want you to take down a couple of words in a place where you're going to see it. Love sounds good and fuzzy. When I say choose love, that just sounds like another meme. So that's not change. That's not awakening a depth of your humanity that wasn't already there. Choices create change. I want to move us beyond just the emotional definition of what love is into a choice that might go a little bit against our normal and awaken who we really are. So today I invite you to think of a single act of against your instinct love and write it down as a commitment to your true identity. Next week we're going to start a series called The Freedom of Forgiveness. And of all the miracles that I believe Jesus performed, I think the greatest miracle God ever performed was the miracle of reconciliation. And it started with the unbelievable, counterintuitive act of forgiveness. You're more creative than I am, but maybe right now there's a person or a group of people that you repeatedly tear down, and maybe you have good reason to do that based on their behavior, or maybe it's popular to mock them. But this week, in some active way, maybe you would choose to honor them, or just choose to keep your mouth shut. Maybe there's someone that you've been taking advantage of, if you're honest with yourself, but this week, you're going to give them something that doesn't benefit you. Maybe the most loving thing someone watching this can do is to finally get the help that they need, to stop trying to face this on your own. The people who love you want you to. Maybe you just need to encourage somebody or empower somebody that you're jealous of. Now, if you've taken down something that makes you a little nervous, makes you wince a little bit, that's okay. Don't be surprised if you feel a little stretch when you're reaching for greatness. Jesus has come to restore you, to make you new, to make you truly human. Trust him, imitate him, choose love. I have a prayer that I've been praying for quite a long time, and I want to share that with you now, and maybe you would pray it with me. Maybe this will be helpful to expand your imagination of what it means to be you. The prayer is this: God, reveal who I am to me and the world around me, because that's how you'll reveal who you really are to me and the world around me. Amen.
Well, thank you, Joseph, for being here with us this weekend at the District Church and for sharing this word with us. I appreciate the encouragement that you are to me and our church and so many churches across the U.S. Hey, just before you leave, a few things. One is, if you're not on our newsletter yet, visit us at districtchurch.org and go to the bottom and sign up for our newsletter so you can stay up to date with everything that's happening and we can learn how to serve you. The next thing is, I want to thank you guys for your generosity. If you haven't yet, you can go online and set up your giving and help automate it so that you can help us continue to advance our mission of making disciples who love, think, and act like Jesus. And then finally, next week, as Joseph said, we're starting a new series called The Freedom of Forgiveness, where we're going to walk through so many different scriptures where Jesus emphasizes the power that we have to forgive our neighbor and to receive forgiveness from Christ. So don't want you to miss that. I love you guys. We'll see you next week. Take care.